Why hello there, you lovely people of the internet. My name is Ali, or the Sierra Mystify, as I have apparently decided to call myself, and my last video got, at this point that I'm recording, 3,000 views. That's right, 3,000. And you know what that means? I'm internet famous now. Yeah, no. On a serious note though, I'm super excited that people are actually coming to my channel now and watching my stuff. I definitely wasn't expecting it to be for something like this, and I don't really see myself becoming like an art commentary channel or somebody who kind of gets into such serious topics so often, but I'm not opposed to revisiting that sort of thing every now and again. What really ended up happening was that on my search for my own answer for this kind of dilemma that we all had, I realized that I needed to dig a lot deeper into this issue and actually do a lot of research to figure out how I felt in terms of cultural appropriation as a whole and actually learn like what the deal is. This first video is going to be talking about cultural appropriation in general. And of course I'm not an expert, I'm somebody who just really started educating myself on it, but hopefully this will be helpful because it is geared more towards artists and it's just kind of giving general kind of thoughts as to what cultural appropriation is and how we should handle it. And the next video, as part of this little series, I guess, will be actually looking into Wendigos. We will talk about the actual legends that exist about Wendigos and use the accounts and opinions on how Wendigos are appropriated, written by people from the culture where it originated, to critique the representations that we see today. Now this video will be a bit long and it's pretty serious, but it really will serve as the backbone for any of these type of videos that I make in the future, and that's why I've put so much work into it. Now, if you have any criticisms of how I handle this subject, please feel free to let me know in the comments. Definitely try to be nice and respectful about this issue. I'm really trying my best, but I'm really kind of out of my element here, so definitely any help from any of you would be greatly appreciated. But without making this video any longer than it already is, let's get into it. I really hope that you will hear me out for the entirety of my argument. I do not intend on calling anyone out or proving anyone wrong here. This is a very large situation with many factors and perspectives, but they are all necessary to show the entire picture. My intent is to just explain the situation as I know it in the broadest and least emotional perspective that I can, so that hopefully we can all understand it better. My opinions and argument have gone through so many changes between my last video and now, and they will probably continue to do so. I want to continue hearing new perspectives and adding new pieces to this puzzle, so feel free to add your own in the comments. It will mean a lot to me. There is no right answer of whether using ideas from other cultures is okay or not. There are many different definitions of cultural appropriation, and even while using one definition, there may be disagreements as to whether a particular instance fits that definition. Then, people will never agree on whether the general concept of cultural appropriation is moral or not. So, truly, this is a matter of your own individual morality, of your background, and your experiences, and it is something you will have to come to your own conclusions about if you ever manage to come to them at all. This is an issue that is much greater and more complicated than whether a doll should have been made, I assure you. That being said, if I am to describe the purpose of this video, there are a couple. I want to express my opinions on this in a way that hopefully encourages you to compare them to your own. I want to educate you on what I have learned and give you tools to use for future scenarios. And I also wanted to take this as an opportunity to discover this for myself, to set the boundaries of what I want to be and create as an artist, and what I want to see others creating. If you are an artist as well, this video is specifically addressed to you. And that's because for everyday people, if you want to, you can get through the day without appropriating just by not participating in activities, fashions, beliefs, or anything that belongs to other cultures. It's not always as easy, but it is often simpler than the way that being an artist interacts with other cultures, and I will be getting into why that is throughout the video. So when I first started writing this script, I was using an essay that I really liked as basically the backbone for my entire argument. And while I still want to really include that a lot, unfortunately, I for some reason found that when I came back to the site for a second time, it is behind a $40 paywall. So that essay is unfortunately not as accessible, but hopefully what I am able to use from that article, what I have notes on, is enough to kind of educate you on the points that it was trying to make. But aside from that, I will also be using some other articles and even some YouTube videos that I've watched, and all of those things will be linked in the description either as their essay form or in a playlist of several videos that I found helpful. So, cultural appreciation is a phrase that is usually used to describe an interaction with other cultures that is seen as positive. The word appreciation rather than appropriation is usually used to differentiate an action that is acceptable or moral from ones that are not. And this is perfectly acceptable. However, I feel that categorizing these interactions, also known as cultural engagements, into positive or negative groups can make the issue seem much more black and white than it really is. The original article I was working with, called "What is the Wrong of Cultural Appropriation?" did not make the distinction between appreciation and appropriation, and defined appropriation as the taking of a valuable yet reusable or non-exhaustible aspect of another individual's culture, usually a symbol or practice, for one's own use, where the taker knows what she is doing or reasonably should know, and where the context of this taking is contested. I will be breaking this down and explaining this definition more soon, but the thing that I would like you to notice is that this definition does not specify this action as being necessarily offensive or harmful, and that's because we are also introduced to the concept of cultural offense, which stands as the word for these situations. So other than the fact that this then leaves cultural appropriation as being the moral gray area that I feel it is, this set of definitions will actually make us take responsibility for just how frequent and common cultural appropriation is in so many of our lives without immediately demonizing our actions. So we are then able to focus on the actual morality and acceptability of each action, rather than being caught up in which category it falls under. There are 4 conditions that must be met for something to be considered cultural appropriation that stem from this definition, and these also can help us to determine how severe and negative the appropriation might be. So I'd like to go through each of these conditions and explain why they are important. The taking condition is pretty simple. It just means that you are taking something that is not yours, where the thing being taken and used is not exhausted, even if its meaning may feel diminished to its original users. The value condition says that the thing that's being taken needs to be of value to those it is taken from, and this value needs to be claimed in some way. Neither one person alone can declare a practice to be of sufficient value, nor can it require all members of a culture to share a collectively declared valuable practice. There are also 5 things to help determine this value. A valuable cultural symbol or practice is ordinarily central to the culture's collective life in some way. It is ordinarily recognizable as such by its membership or a large number of its members, and it has value to a significant number of its members. The 4th criterion recommends amplifying the voices of those who are most affected within the culture over those who may have more relative power. So I needed an example to understand this one, and it might apply in an instance where, let's say, a woman is expected to participate in a specific practice and men are kind of the enforcers of this practice, so the women should be the ones who are more in charge of determining the value of this practice. The 5th criterion pertains to whether the practice or symbol has only historical or also contemporary use. So, if a culture no longer exists or a culture no longer partakes in a specific practice, then that practice can't be appropriated because nobody is claiming it anymore. The contested condition says that there are members of the culture, and in some cases their allies, from whom a practice or symbol is appropriated, who dispute the appropriation of a practice. Contestation is meaningful if it is sustained over time by multiple members of the culture from whom the symbol or practice is being appropriated, and if culturally specific justifications or explanations are at the heart of the dispute. So you can see really solid examples of contestation in this sense when you see an example of cultural appropriation that has happened over a very long period of time. People have been speaking out about it over a long period of time, and the arguments that these people are making are really strong. One cannot culturally appropriate from a group who wills you to take and use aspects or all of their culture, at least if you do so in the way that they recognize as legitimate. Proselytizing religions would seem a good example here. Those claiming cultural appropriation on behalf of others can be problematic. Of course, those being appropriated from, especially if marginalized, should not need to constantly make public protestations, and having broader allies can be important to ensure that contestation is heard. But this does not mean that third parties can simply claim a cultural appropriation on behalf of others. It's not their claim to make. Now this part was really interesting to hear. The withdrawal of consent matters more than consent in this case. And that's because most of the time, these groups are not going to have a list of things that you should and a list of things that you shouldn't do when it comes to interacting with their culture. It's something that kind of needs to be figured out as we go along. So I interpret that as meaning that it might be beneficial for us to forgive some mistakes when they truly are mistakes, but that also means that we should be very, very conscious of when that consent is removed from the situation. And then there is the knowledge or culpable ignorance condition. This condition is missing from my notes, unfortunately, because that was as far as I was able to get in the day that I had the essay available to take notes on it, but I think that we can probably understand the point of this pretty easily just by going off the title. Culpable ignorance is the lack of knowledge or understanding that results from the omission of ordinary care to acquire such knowledge or understanding. So I think that we can figure that this section would discuss whether the group or person that is appropriating this item or idea did their due diligence to research and try to understand the meaning, importance, or context of that thing that they are appropriating. It probably goes without saying that someone who does not understand something will not be able to present it in an accurate way, and I feel that most textbook examples of cultural appropriation are very guilty of this. There is a very big difference between the result of someone just using their surface level knowledge and stereotypes that have been formed of a group as the backing of their creation, versus what is created after a very thoughtful examination of a topic is conducted. So I think that pretty well covers what can be defined as cultural appropriation, but there are some other pretty major factors that come into this that we can discuss further. The dominant culture refers to a group that has clear power over others within a particular political, social, or economic entity in which multiple cultures are present. The minority cultures cannot appropriate culture in the same way that the dominant one does, because the dominant culture will often force its practices on the minority cultures, or at least it will often be implied that aspects of the dominant culture are more acceptable or desirable. Therefore, minority cultures will often have to adopt these in order to survive or at least thrive in that setting. One of the most obvious examples of this is how attributes that are considered to be more white or more American, depending on where you live, are desirable in many situations, including professional ones. It definitely can be said that the more attributes a minority culture takes from the dominant culture, the more that culture will be assimilated into the dominant culture. Therefore, it seems reasonable to say that the people in those minority groups will support their culture by taking part in it, so those decisions should be supported. However, I do not feel that those people should be discouraged if they decide to participate in the dominant culture's practices, especially if it is for the sake of survival or make their life easier. It really should just be up to them. Dominant cultures appropriate minority cultures often because they see the cultural practices of that group like resources that they can take and profit from. But they also do it because they just happen to like it for one reason or another. There really is such irony, though, that takes place when a culture switches from demeaning and discriminating based on attributes of a particular culture to viewing those same attributes as something that they can use for their own benefit. That is why, in examples of that occurring, minority groups can become especially protective of their practices. It is also possible, though, for minority cultures to appropriate other cultures. Even though there isn't as much of a power dynamic, and that will often result in this action seeming less harmful, it does affect the situation in similar ways. Your intentions really matter, but they are not everything. It is very obvious when someone is intentionally disrespecting a culture. In situations like art, this can be seen when an artist is speaking out against a part of a particular culture and they basically weaponize the offensiveness of their art. Another example is when art purposefully portrays offensive images in an attempt to speak out against discrimination or misrepresentation. However, these efforts can often be interpreted as misrepresentative themselves. But most of the time, the most damaging cases of cultural appropriation are not when a person is intentionally trying to be offensive due to their hatred towards that group, since those cases are pretty rare and are usually pretty easy to pick a side on. They are actually when the people involved are very indifferent towards that culture or they just don't care about it. In these instances, people who also do not know or care about that culture will usually also see no harm in the actions that were taken, and how could you expect them to? Unless they had some other reason to relate to the people of that culture, they probably would not understand their position. And because the intentions of these appropriators are usually not malicious, it will be difficult for them to understand where the problem would be. These indifferent people will often just take something from a cultural group and use it however they want. They will make it something that fits in with the dominant culture and dissociate it completely from its source. This makes it all the more dangerous because people will defend it by saying that it cannot offend that group because it is no longer associated with it. I do believe that there is a line that you can cross where something becomes so far removed that you can call it original. However, in most of these cases, the appropriators do not care enough to sever those ties. It would be very surprising if a culture was able to be well represented by someone who did not understand it well, because more often than not, the way that minority cultures are treated leads to most general knowledge about them being false. Even if those minority cultures are given equal opportunities now, the years and years of not being able to speak for themselves have most likely done a number on their reputation. Often, minority cultures are viewed by those within dominant cultures as fantastical versions of themselves. They can be associated with beautiful spirituality, wildness, or with the vague ideas of exoticness. This can lead to people wanting to take part in and associate themselves with those cultures. It also leads to many depictions of these cultures being horribly inaccurate. In cases where a culture is not well represented, the work is transformed from something that, to the individuals of that culture, is relatable and something they can connect to, into a sort of attack on how they identify themselves. I'd imagine that it feels like the creators are trying to correct them on their own cultural practices and inform them on the forms of those practices that are desirable. In cases where a person outside of their culture is being praised for participating in something that they had gotten discriminated against for, it can feel like the fact that they belong to a different culture made them more desirable. So, okay, I've been through what cultural appropriation is and how it can go very, very wrong, but how about the flip side? Is it possible for cultural appropriation to be okay or even good? Cultural appropriation cannot and will not be stopped. For most of us who are truly considering the morality of appropriation, we want to see aspects of culture thriving, being seen, being taught, and being well represented. Maybe you are made aware of a cultural tradition that has been misrepresented time and time again, then realize the beautiful and precious origins of that tradition and want to see it represented properly, because that's how I currently feel. I believe that it should not be the responsibility of minority cultures to beg us to respect them anymore, and we as white artists should not continue perpetuating the idea that we cannot handle portraying any amount of culture without ruining it and harming the people who inspired our art to begin with. We can do better than that, and we need to. I don't think that we should continue to trample all over other people's culture, but I think that hiding away from the responsibility of learning and appreciating other people's cultures won't get us any farther. Now, please don't get me wrong, I obviously do not want everyone to try to become experts in other people's cultures and try to make their art for them for several reasons. The first being that some people are not okay with the idea of appropriating anything, and that is absolutely okay. Even if you just don't want to risk offending anyone, you do not have to try to depict other cultures if you do not want to. Unless people from that culture specifically ask you to, I guarantee that no one is expecting you to be the savior of that tradition, and you should not believe that your artwork will make you one. This is why I completely support Delightful's decision to remove the video featuring the Wendigo doll. I also believe that the artwork and stories that are created by people from those cultures should always hold more value than the ones created by others. Our goal should be to keep these things alive, not to replace them and make them disappear. I think if you agree with the rest of what I have talked about, you can also agree that there are certain aspects of other cultures that are best left to be taken part in by those people. That would relate to the value condition, and if a tradition is central or sacred to that culture. But I believe that as long as you are fulfilling your duty when it comes to the knowledge or culpable ignorance condition, you should be able to use your common sense to determine if a cultural practice is too valuable or sacred to be used in the way you intend to use it. On the other hand, when it comes to art, it is actually becoming very important for minority cultures to get represented. Let's say, for example, you are working on a project in which you are creating a cast of characters. If you are part of a dominant culture and you completely exclude other cultures from that cast, you will, unintentionally or otherwise, be sending out a signal that the dominant culture is the default. This is just due to the fact that through the lens of popular media up until this point, that has been the truth. And so then, say you realize this and decide to include some more diversity in this group. If you are unwilling to research and portray the aspects of the culture that you are claiming a character is part of, you are going to be misrepresenting that culture. You cannot just give them a different skin tone if that applies, or base their costume off of what you imagine that group wearing. There are elements of other cultures that will completely change the experience of the people within them, and proper representation will need to take this into account. With all of that said, I want to propose that those of us who are in a dominant culture strive for the very best representation that we can create when it comes to depicting cultural groups outside of our own. There are a couple ways I think that you can achieve this if you feel very passionate about supporting these cultural practices and experiences. The first and best is to involve someone from that culture and to hold their input very highly. If you are writing a story or creating visual art based on their story or cultural experience, actually tell that story. Sure, do a good job and make it something that people can enjoy, but don't change it. If you feel yourself wanting to change it or not valuing their input, you do not care about their experience enough that you should be making something about it. And the same conclusion applies if you receive feedback from that group that your work is not functioning correctly or makes them uncomfortable, and you do not stop the project and reassess it. This is how unintentional cultural offense or misrepresentation is made. If actually getting into contact with someone who is of that culture is impossible, here's option 2. Do your research. Do your absolute best to understand everything about what you are appropriating, and make sure that you truly care about the subject enough to represent it properly. Get direct information. Get multiple sources of information. Just get lost in it and do it justice in your work. But do not try to justify your preconceived ideas of what you want your work to be and why they are close enough to that culture that you can squeeze by. Once again, if you care about it enough, you won't. Be honest with yourself. You also will need to understand if the context of your artwork or story is not suitable for this tradition to be placed within it. Often, these practices hold specific significance to these groups because of their past, so separating them from their original context is still misrepresenting them. If you don't pass those tests, though, luckily there is a third option, and it is also the easiest. Create an inspired work. Call it something new. Actually be creative and make something that belongs to you. Do not just take their practice and rename it, but come up with something that makes you feel just as passionate without taking that passion from somebody else. I feel that there is so much that we can learn from people's lives that are very separate from our own, and doing that will provide much more depth to our work. And that way, those cultural groups that you are inspired by can still relate to your work in some ways freely, if they do, without that work coming back and attempting to define them in ways that they just don't agree with. Sure, it doesn't expand the general knowledge or appreciation of that culture, but like I said, unless someone from that culture specifically asks you to, there is absolutely no obligation for you to do that. But with that, we're actually done. I'm kind of shocked. We actually did it. We actually made it through this. And I don't know if it's really weird to say, but I'm honestly proud of both of us. I'm proud of myself for sticking with it, even though it was really a tough thing to go through, and I'm proud of you for actually giving me a chance to say my whole piece on it. So with that, I'd really love it if you stuck around, maybe subscribed, liked it, especially comment it and tell me what you think. I would super duper appreciate that. But that's the end, and I'll probably be coming back with something a little less intense, and I'll be seeing you when I see you.